The air in the grand ballroom was thick and heavy, a mixture of expensive perfume, the faint waxy scent of polished floors, and the savory aroma of hors d'oeuvres that were beginning to cool under the soft lights. It was the kind of room that was designed to impress, with high ceilings draped in swaths of cream-colored fabric and crystal chandeliers that cast 1,000 tiny dancing reflections on the marble floors. But for the young woman moving through the crowd with a heavy tray, it was just another workplace. Her feet ached inside the sensible black shoes she'd worn for 100 similar nights, and the crisp white uniform felt stiff and unforgiving against her skin. She was a ghost in this world of wealth and influence. The guests, dressed in shimmering gowns and sharp dark suits, would look right through her, their eyes glazing over as she offered them a choice between stuffed mushrooms and miniature quiches. Their thanks, when they came, were brief and automatic, a mere formality before they turned back to their conversations, which were a low, constant hum of networking and polite insincerity. She moved with a practiced efficiency, her path through the tables a well-rehearsed dance. She knew which guests had finished their drinks, which ones were nursing a half-full glass of champagne, and which ones were ready for a fresh one. Her mind was a quiet, running tally of needs and observations, a skill she had honed over years of working in service. At the front of the room, on a small stage raised just a few feet off the ground, sat the source of the room's subtle discomfort. It was a grand piano, a gleaming black beast of polished wood and gleaming wire. Its lid was propped open, revealing the hammers and strings, a complex inner workings that promised beautiful music. But the bench was empty. The piano sat there, silent and imposing, like a guest who had arrived for the party but refused to speak. It was meant to be the heart of the evening's ambience, a soft, eat-o-went soundtrack to the charity fundraiser for the city's children's hospital. A renowned local pianist had been booked for months, his name a draw on the invitations. But an hour before the event was due to start, the organizer had received a call. A family emergency, a deep, apologetic voice on the other end of the line, and a sudden, gaping hole in the evening's schedule. Now, the silence from the stage made everything else seem louder. The clinking of a fork against a plate echoed with a startling clarity. A forced laugh from a nearby table cut through the low hum of conversation, sounding brittle and hollow. The lack of music created a vacuum, and the room's forced elegance was struggling to fill it. The guests were trying, of course. They smiled and chatted, but there was an undercurrent of awkwardness, sense that the evening was not quite living up to its promise. The air felt flat, like a glass of champagne that had been left out for too long. The young woman, weaving her way through the tables, couldn't help but glance at the empty piano bench every time she passed the stage. Each time, a familiar, long-dormant ache tightened in her chest. It was a feeling she had tried to bury, to ignore, to push down under the weight of daily responsibilities. But the sight of the silent piano, waiting for a touch that wasn't coming, brought it all rushing back. She remembered a time when music had been her whole world. As a young girl, she had spent hours at her family's old, slightly out-of-tune upright piano, her fingers flying across the yellowed ivory keys. She had been a natural, her teachers had said, prodigy with a gift for melody and a deep, intuitive understanding of harmony. Music had been her language, her refuge, her dream. She had imagined herself on stages like this, in front of crowds who were there to listen, to be moved by the music she created. She had won competitions, earned scholarships, and for a while, it had seemed like her dream was within her grasp. But life, she had learned, had a way of intervening. Dreams, she had discovered, didn't pay the rent. The pressure to be practical, to have a stable career, to be a responsible adult, had been immense. It had been a slow, creeping process, a series of small compromises that had eventually led her away from the piano and into the world of service jobs. First, it was just to save up some money, a temporary detour. Then, a family illness had drained her savings. Then, the bills had started to pile up, and the music had started to feel like a luxury she could no longer afford. The hours she used to spend practicing were now spent working double shifts. The music in her head slowly replaced by the clatter of dishes and the constant, low-level stress of making ends meet. She hadn't touched a piano in years. The thought was too painful, a reminder of a life she had let slip away. It was easier to pretend that part of her didn't exist, to focus on the immediate, tangible tasks of her job. Clear the table, take the order, refill the drink. It was a life of small, manageable tasks. A life that didn't leave much room for grand, impractical dreams. As she circled the room, collecting empty glasses, she overheard snippets of conversation. A man in a tuxedo was talking about a recent business deal, his voice loud and self-important. A woman in a sequin dress was complaining about the traffic, her brow furrowed in a picture of manufactured distress. They were all performing, playing their parts in a grand social drama. And she was just a stagehand, invisible and unimportant. But the piano was different. It was a silent witness to it all, a symbol of the beauty and art that was missing from the room. It represented the gap between what the evening was supposed to be and what it had become. And for the young woman, it represented the gap between the life she was living and the life she had once imagined. She watched the event organizer, a woman in a smart navy blue dress, pacing nervously near the stage. The organizer was clutching her phone, her face pale with stress. She was trying to hold it all together, to maintain a facade of calm professionalism. But the young woman could see the panic in her eyes. She knew that look, the feeling of a carefully constructed plan falling apart. The weight of responsibility pressing down on you, the young woman felt a pang of sympathy for the organizer. She knew what it was like to have a bad night at work, to feel like everything was going wrong. But this was on a different scale. This was a high-profile event, with important guests and a lot of money at stake. The failure of the music was more than just a minor inconvenience. It was a fundamental flaw in the evening's design. As she finished her round, she returned to the kitchen to drop off her tray of empty glasses. The hot, chaotic energy of the kitchen was a stark contrast to the cool, strained elegance of the ballroom. The chefs were shouting orders. The clatter of pots and pans was a constant. Deafening roar, and the air was thick with the smell of garlic and frying onions. It was a world of raw, unfiltered reality. A world she understood. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for another round. She picked up a fresh tray of hors d'oeuvres, the weight of it, a familiar comfort on her palm. As she pushed open the swinging door and stepped back into the ballroom, her eyes were drawn, once again, to the silent piano. It sat there, waiting, a potential that was not being realized. And in that moment, something shifted inside her. The years of hiding, of practicality, of telling herself that her dream of music was a childish fantasy, suddenly felt like a heavy cloak she had been wearing for too long. She looked at the tense face of the organizer, at the bored expressions of the guests, and at the silent, waiting piano. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to wonder, what if? The ballroom's atmosphere continued to sour, the initial polite awkwardness curdling into a palpable tension. Without the soft cushion of music to absorb the sound, every small noise became an intrusion. The clatter of a dropped fork against a porcelain plate was like a gunshot, causing heads to turn and a momentary hush to fall before the forced, brittle conversations resumed. A woman's high, forced laugh cut through the low hum of the crowd, sounding less like genuine amusement and more like a cry for attention. The silence from the stage was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a heavy, oppressive presence, a void that sucked the warmth and life out of the room. The guests were trying their best to maintain the facade of a sophisticated evening, but their smiles were beginning to look strained, their eyes darting around the room. Searching for a distraction that wasn't there, the young woman moved through the crowd, her tray now lighter, her focus shifting from the needs of the guests to the oppressive mood of the room. She felt the collective discomfort like a physical weight. It was in the way people huddled in their small groups, speaking in slightly louder whispers, as if trying to drown out the silence with their own voices. It was in the way the event organizer, a woman in a smart navy blue dress, was now standing with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face a mask of professional distress. The organizer had given up on her phone, her frantic calls having yielded no last-minute miracles. Now, she was just a spectator to the slow-motion failure of her event. Her carefully constructed evening unraveling one awkward moment at a time, as the young woman passed a table near the front. She couldn't help but overhear the conversation of a well-dressed couple. The man, a portly figure in a tuxedo that seemed a size too small, outside, dramatically running a hand through his slick-back hair. "Dreadful, this silence," he said to his companion, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet room. "They could have at least hired a DJ. It's the least they could do for what we paid for these tickets." His wife, a woman with a string of pearls around her neck and a look of perpetual boredom, nodded in agreement, taking a delicate sip of her champagne. "It's just so flat," she replied, her voice a low whine. "No atmosphere at all." The words, though not directed at her, struck the young woman with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just the criticism of the event, though she felt a pang of sympathy for the organizer. It was the dismissive tone, the casual cruelty of people who had never known what it was like to have a plan fall apart, to have your best efforts not be enough. Something inside her, a knot of frustration and long-suppressed yearning, began to tighten. She had spent years being invisible, of being the person who cleared the plates and filled the glasses, the backdrop to other people's lives. She had accepted it, told herself it was necessary, that it was the grown-up thing to do. But tonight, in this room full of people who seemed to care only about appearances and their own comfort, something felt different. She looked at the organizer, who was now staring at the silent piano with an expression of utter defeat. She looked at the guests, their faces a mixture of boredom, annoyance, and polite disinterest. And she looked at the piano, sitting there like a caged bird, its voice silenced, its potential locked away. It was a perfect metaphor for her own life, a life of quiet desperation, of a talent she had locked away for fear of not being good enough, of not being practical enough, the thought that had been flickering in the back of her mind since she first saw the empty bench now burst into a full-blown, terrifying, and exhilarating idea. What if she just played? What if she walked up there, sat down, and filled the silence with the music that was still living inside her, a music she had tried so hard to forget? The idea was absurd. It was reckless. It was the kind of thing a person in a movie would do, not a real person with rent to pay and a job to keep. A dozen voices of doubt and reason immediately began to scream in her head. "You can't do that," one voice said. "You're a waitress. You'll be fired on the spot. You haven't played in years," another voice chimed in. "Your fingers are stiff. You'll make a fool of yourself. They'll laugh at you," a third, crueler voice whispered. "They'll see you for what you are, a help who's forgotten her place." She felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. Her heart began to pound against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird beating its wings against a cage. She looked down at her hands, holding the empty tray. They were the hands of a waitress, chapped from the constant washing of dishes, nicked and scarred from years of handling hot pans and sharp knives. They were not the hands of a pianist, not the hands of the artist she had once dreamed of becoming. She turned away from the stage, intending to go back to the kitchen, to the safety and anonymity of her job, but her feet felt like they were rooted to the spot. She took a step, then another, her movements slow and heavy, as if she were wading through a deep river of doubt. The man's words echoed in her mind. Dreadful, this silence. It was right. It was dreadful. But it wasn't just the silence of the room. It was the silence in her own heart, the quiet place where her music used to be. She stopped and looked back at the piano. It seemed to be calling to her, a silent siren song. She remembered the feeling of her fingers on the keys, the way the music would flow through her, a current of pure emotion that could make her laugh or cry, that could express the things she could never put into words. Music had been her first language, her truest form of self-expression, and in that moment she realized how much she missed it, how much a part of her had been missing without it. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in her stomach. But now there was something else too, a flicker of defiance, a spark of the girl she used to be, the girl who wasn't afraid to take a risk, who believed in the power of her own music. She thought about the organizer, who was trying so hard to make a difference, to raise money for sick children. She thought about the guests, who were so disconnected from each other, so lost in their own worlds of wealth and status. And she thought about the music, the one thing that could bridge that gap, that could remind them all of their shared humanity. She took a deep breath, the air catching in her throat. She looked at the tray in her hands, a symbol of the life she had chosen, the life of practicality and invisibility. And then, with a sudden, decisive movement, she walked over to a small service table against the wall and placed the tray down. The small clink of the glassware against the metal tray sounded like a final, definitive decision. She smoothed down her apron, a nervous, unconscious gesture. She could feel the eyes of a few guests on her, their expressions curious. She ignored them, her gaze fixed on the stage. She began to walk, her steps slow at first, then more confident. Each step was a small rebellion, a rejection of the invisible role she had been assigned for so long. The murmurs of the crowd began to quiet down as more and more people noticed the waitress, in the black uniform, walking with a purpose that was not related to serving food or drinks. A path seemed to open up for her, a silent corridor of staring faces and confused expressions. She could feel their eyes on her, a mix of curiosity, amusement, and disapproval. She kept her head up, her eyes locked on the empty bench. The organizer saw her then. Her face immediately shifted from distress to outright panic. She began to walk quickly toward the stage, her hands held out in a gesture of warning. "Excuse me?" she called out, her voice sharp and strained. "You can't be up there. Staff only." But the young woman didn't stop. She didn't even look at the organizer. She was in a bubble of her own making, a world where the only thing that mattered was the silent piano and the music that was waiting to be born. She reached the stage, took the 2 small steps up, and walked across the polished wooden floor. The whole room was watching now, the silence absolute, broken only by the soft sound of her shoes on the stage and the organizer's frantic, hissed command. "You can't be up there?" The organizer's voice was a sharp, panicked whisper that cut through the stunned silence of the room. "What do you think you're doing? You'll lose your job," she hissed, her face a mixture of fury and disbelief as she reached the edge of the stage. But the young woman didn't seem to hear her. Her focus was entirely on the polished black beast in front of her, the silent, waiting piano. She moved with a strange, fluid grace, a confidence that seemed completely out of place. She wasn't walking like a waitress anymore. She was walking like an artist approaching her canvas. She reached the bench and sat down. The cool, smooth wood was a familiar shock against her thighs, a sensation she hadn't realized she missed so much. The whole room was holding its breath. Every eye was on her, 100 pairs of eyes staring in confusion, annoyance, and a flicker of morbid curiosity. The organizer stood at the foot of the stage, her hands clenched into fists, ready to drag the young woman off by her arm. But something in the young woman's posture, quiet stillness that radiated a strange kind of power, made her hesitate. The young woman placed her fingers on the ivory keys. They felt both foreign and familiar, like shaking hands with an old friend you haven't seen in a decade. Her hands were trembling, a fine, almost invisible tremor that ran from her fingertips all the way up her arms. She could feel the weight of 100 stares pressing down on her. The silent judgment of a room full of people who saw her as nothing more than a help who had forgotten her place. The voices of doubt in her head were screaming, a chaotic chorus of fear and self-consciousness. Asterisk, you're going to embarrass yourself. You're going to ruin this event. You're going to be fired. Asterisk, the organizer took a step onto the stage, her face set with grim determination. "I'm calling security," she said, her voice low and threatening. The young woman finally looked up, her eyes meeting the organizer's. There was no defiance in her gaze, no anger, just a deep, quiet calm. "Just one song," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but it carried a surprising weight in the silent room. To fill the silence, the organizer stopped. There was something in the young woman's eyes, a sincerity and a depth of feeling that was disarming. It was the look of someone who wasn't trying to cause trouble, but was trying to offer a solution, the only one she had. The organizer saw the desperation in her own situation reflected in the young woman's eyes, and she felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to let her try. What did she have to lose? The evening was already a failure. A scene caused by a rogue waitress couldn't make it much worse. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and stepped back off the stage. Her arms still crossed, but her expression had shifted from anger to a wary, uncertain curiosity. The young woman took a deep, shaky breath and closed her eyes. She shut out the staring crowd, the glittering chandeliers, the worried face of the organizer. She shut out the voices of doubt in her head and tried to remember the feeling of being lost in the music. She tried to remember the girl she used to be. The girl who believed that music could heal anything, who believed that a simple melody could change the world, and then she began to play. It wasn't a showy classical piece or a popular jazz standard that the guests would recognize. It was a simple, haunting melody she had composed herself as a teenager. A song born from a place of quiet melancholy and fragile hope. The first few notes were a little rusty, her fingers stiffed from years of disuse. But as the melody began to unfold, a muscle memory she thought she had lost kicked in. Her fingers, which felt clumsy and rough just moments before, suddenly remembered their purpose. They found their footing. Moving with a newfound confidence and grace across the keys, the effect was instantaneous and profound. The low, tense hum of conversation died down completely. The man in the too-tight tuxedo, who had been complaining so loudly, stopped mid-sentence, his mouth slightly agape. The woman with the pearls lowered her champagne glass, her bored expression replaced by one of rapt attention. The music seemed to wrap itself around the room, a soft, warm blanket that muffled the clinking of glasses and the rustle of silk dresses. It was a sound that was both sad and beautiful, sound that spoke of loss and longing, but also of a quiet, unshakable strength. As the young woman played, she began to relax. The tension in her shoulders eased, and the trembling in her hands subsided. She was no longer aware of the crowd or the fear of being judged. She was lost in the music, in the story the notes were telling. It was her story, the story of a dream that had been put on hold. A life that had been lived in black and white, but was now, for a few brief moments, exploding into color. Her body began to sway slightly, a subtle, unconscious movement that showed she was completely absorbed in the music. The melody was like a conversation, a question and answer between the left and right hands. It was a thread of gold weaving its way through the heavy, oppressive silence of the room, transforming it into something sacred. The music seemed to soften the hard edges of the ballroom, making the crystal chandeliers seem less like cold, glittering symbols of wealth and more like stars in a night sky. It made the marble floors feel less like a stage for social posturing and more like the ground of a shared, human experience. The guests, who had been so focused on their own little worlds of networking and status, were now united in a single shared experience. They were no longer a collection of separate, competing individuals, but a single audience. It's connected by the power of the music. The forced smiles began to soften into genuine expressions of emotion. Some people closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. Others leaned forward in their seats, their faces filled with a childlike wonder. The cynical businessman, the one who had complained about the lack of a DJ, had a strange, reflective look on his face. As if the music was reminding him of a time when he was less jaded, more open to the beauty of the world. The music swelled, growing in complexity and intensity, filling every corner of the vast ballroom. It was a wave of sound that carried with it a lifetime of unspoken feelings, a torrent of joy and sorrow, of love and loss. It was the sound of a heart that had been broken but had learned to beat again, spirit that had been dimmed but had refused to be extinguished. And then, as gently as it had begun, it faded. The last note hung in the air for a moment, a single, perfect sound that seemed to hold all the emotion of the song. And then it was gone. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It wasn't an awkward, oppressive void. It was a full, reverent silence, a sacred space filled with the echoes of the music. No one wanted to be the first to break it. They just sat there, in a state of collective awe, their minds and hearts still processing what they had just heard. Then, a single person began to clap. It was an older man in the back, a retired music teacher who knew a rare talent when he heard one. His clap was slow and deliberate, a sound of pure, unfiltered appreciation. It was followed by another and then another, until the entire room erupted in a wave of genuine, heartfelt applause. It was not the polite, obligatory clap for a scheduled performer, but a raw, emotional release, a sound of gratitude for a moment of unexpected beauty. The young woman, jolted back to reality by the sound, opened her eyes. A flush of red crept up her neck, and she looked out at the standing ovation with a look of shock and confusion. She had been so lost in the music that she had forgotten where she was, who she was. For a few minutes, she wasn't a waitress. She was a musician. And now, the weight of that reality, and the reality of the hundreds of eyes on her, came crashing down. She stood up quickly from the bench, her hands trembling again. She felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to disappear, to go back to being invisible. She gave a small, awkward bow, her eyes fixed on the floor, and then she practically ran from the stage. Eager to escape the adoration and the attention that felt so foreign and uncomfortable, the applause was a physical force, a wave of sound that washed over her, warm and overwhelming. It was a sound she had only ever dreamed of hearing, sound reserved for the people on the stage, not the people serving the drinks. But it was for her. The realization hit her with the force of a tidal wave, and a fresh wave of panic surged through her. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like a spotlight had been switched on, illuminating a part of her she had kept hidden for years. She couldn't breathe. The air in the grand ballroom, once just thick with perfume and wealth, now felt thin and suffocating. Without thinking, she turned and fled. She didn't take a bow. She didn't acknowledge the adoring crowd. She just ran, her sensible black shoes making a frantic, slapping sound on the polished wooden stage, and then the soft carpet of the ballroom floor. She could feel 100 pairs of eyes following her, 100 whispers starting to bloom in her wake. She pushed through a pair of heavy velvet curtains at the side of the stage, escaping the blinding lights and the adoring gaze of the crowd, and found herself in the cool, dark quiet of a service corridor. She leaned against the rough concrete wall, her heart pounding like a trapped bird against her ribs. She took a deep, ragged breath, the air smelling of bleach and dish soap, a stark, grounding contrast to the cloying scent of the ballroom. She was safe. She was hidden. She could feel the heat in her cheeks, a deep, burning blush that she was sure was visible, even in the dim light of the corridor. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the memory of the standing ovation. The sound of their applause, the feeling of being seen. It was too much. It was all too much. Back in the ballroom, the applause was finally dying down, placed by a low, excited buzz of conversation. The atmosphere had undergone a seismic shift. The awkward, forced politeness was gone, replaced by a warm, vibrant energy. People were no longer just talking to the person next to them. They were leaning across tables, their faces animated, their gestures expressive. They were talking about the music, about the young woman in the waitress uniform who had played with such raw, unfiltered emotion. The organizer stood near the stage, a look of utter disbelief on her face. She was clapping along with everyone else, her mind racing. She had been ready to call security, to have the young woman escorted out of the building. She had been picturing the disaster reports, the negative reviews, the irate phone calls from donors. But instead, she was witnessing a miracle. The young woman, with her simple, haunting melody, had done what no amount of planning or catering could do. She had touched the hearts of everyone in the room. She had reminded them all why they were there, not just to be seen, but to feel, to connect. To make a difference, the cynical man in the too-tight tuxedo was now talking to his wife, his usual sarcastic expression replaced by one of thoughtful wonder. "I haven't heard anything like that since I don't know when," he said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "It reminded me of my mother. She used to play the piano. Not like that, of course, but it felt the same. It felt like home." His wife, for the first time that evening, looked at him with a genuine warmth, her hand reaching across the table to cover his. He then excused himself and walked over to the organizer, his usual swagger replaced by a quiet humility. "That music," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "That's what this is all about. It reminded me why we're here. These kids, they need more than just money. They need hope. and that music. It felt like hope. He then proceeded to pull out his checkbook, write a check for an amount that made the organizer's eyes widen in disbelief. It was double what he had originally pledged. The organizer watched him walk away, then turned her gaze back to the empty stage. She knew she had to find the young woman. She had to thank her, to understand her, to figure out what to do next. She excused herself from a group of guests who were still, gushing about the performance, and pushed through the same velvet curtains. The young woman had disappeared through just moments. Before, she found her in the service corridor, leaning against the wall, her head in her hands. The young woman looked up, her eyes wide with fear like a cornered animal. "I'm so sorry," she stammered, her voice trembling. "I don't know what came over me. I'll understand if you want me to leave. I'll pack my things right now." The organizer was taken aback by the young woman's fear. She had expected defiance, or maybe a cocky confidence. But all she saw was a deep-seated vulnerability, a fear of rejection that was painfully familiar. She softened her expression, her professional mask slipping away to reveal the woman underneath. A woman who was just as moved by the music as everyone else. "Don't be sorry," the organizer said, her voice gentle. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." "Who are you?" The young woman looked down, her cheeks flushing again. "I'm just one of the waitresses," she mumbled, her voice barely a whisper. "I really have to get back to work." She tried to slip away, to disappear back into the anonymity of her role, but the organizer gently touched her arm. "No," the organizer said, her voice firm but kind. "You're not just one of the waitresses. Not after that. You're a musician, and you just saved my event." The young woman looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and a flicker of something else, something that looked a lot like hope. She had spent so long telling herself that her music was a thing of the past, a childish fantasy she had outgrown. But to hear someone else, a stranger, call her a musician, it felt like a key turning in a locked door inside her heart. The rest of the evening was a blur for the young woman. She went back to work, her tray feeling lighter, her steps feeling a little bit springier. But everything was different now. The guests didn't look through her anymore. They smiled at her, their eyes filled with a new respect and admiration. They stopped her as she passed their tables, not to ask for a refill, but to offer a sincere compliment. "That was a truly beautiful performance," one woman said, her hand on her heart. "You have a real gift," another man told her, his voice filled with genuine appreciation. The cynical man in the tuxedo caught her eye as she was clearing his table and gave her a small, respectful nod. It was a simple gesture, but it meant more to her than any standing ovation. It was a sign that she had been seen, not as a waitress, not as a troublemaker, but as an artist who had touched his soul. The ballroom was filled with a new kind of energy. The conversations were no longer just about business and social status. People were talking about their feelings, their memories, their own hidden talents. The music had unlocked something in them, a shared humanity that had been buried under layers of wealth and propriety. The clinking of glasses and the low hum of conversation were no longer a sign of awkwardness, but a celebration of a shared, unexpected moment of connection. As the evening drew to a close, the organizer stood at the door, thanking the guests as they left. The mood was buoyant, the atmosphere warm and festive. The final tally for the fundraiser was in, and it was a staggering success. They had not only met their goal, but had vastly exceeded it. A result the organizer knew, without a doubt, was entirely due to the shift in the room's energy after the song. She scanned the room, looking for the young woman. She found her quietly stacking chairs in a corner, her waitress uniform a stark reminder of the world she was about to return to. The organizer felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name. It was a mix of gratitude, admiration, and a sense of responsibility. She couldn't just let this young woman go back to a life of invisibility, her extraordinary talent hidden away like a secret. She had to do something. She walked over to the young woman, who looked up, her expression wary, as if expecting the other shoe to drop. "I just wanted to thank you again," the organizer said, her voice warm. "You didn't just save my event tonight. You reminded everyone in this room what it means to be human. That was a gift you shouldn't waste." The young woman looked down, a small, shy smile playing on her lips. It was just one song, she said. No, the organizer said, her voice firm. It was more than that. It was everything. She paused, a thoughtful look on her face. I have some friends. People in the music business. I'm going to make some calls. I don't know what will come of it, but I have a feeling this isn't the last time you'll be playing on a stage. The young woman looked up, her eyes wide with a dawning, terrifying, and exhilarating possibility. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, her dream wasn't as far away as she thought. The morning after the fundraiser arrived with the shrill, insistent beep of an old digital alarm clock, it was a sound that meant reality, a sound that meant bills to be paid and shifts to be worked. For a long moment, the young woman lay in bed. The thin blanket pulled up to her chin, staring at the water-stained patch on her ceiling. The events of the previous night felt like a dream, a bizarre, wonderful fantasy that her mind had constructed to escape the monotony of her life. The standing ovation, the looks of awe on the faces of the wealthy guests, the heartfelt compliments, it all seemed unreal. A movie she had watched instead of lived. She swung her legs out of bed, her feet touching the cold, worn linoleum of her small apartment. The air was still and quiet, a stark contrast to the opulent energy of the ballroom. She walked over to the small, chipped mirror above her sink and looked at her reflection. Her face was pale, her eyes tired. She saw the same person she saw every morning, a woman in her late 20s with tired eyes and a quiet, unassuming air. There was no trace of the confident musician who had held a room full of influential people in the palm of her hand. There was only the waitress, the invisible help who cleared plates and filled glasses. A wave of doubt, cold and sharp, washed over her. What if she had made a complete fool of herself? What if the applause was just a polite, indulgent gesture, a form of pity for the delusional waitress who thought she could play? What if she was going to be fired, not just from the catering company, but from her regular job at the restaurant, too? The thought sent a jolt of panic through her. She needed that job. It was the one stable thing in her life, the one thing that kept her afloat. She got dressed, her movements slow and heavy, the weight of her anxiety pressing down on her. She pulled on her familiar uniform, the crisp white shirt and black skirt feeling like a suit of armor, a way to hide the vulnerable, uncertain person underneath. She skipped breakfast, her stomach a knot of nervous energy, and headed out the door, her heart pounding with a dread that intensified with every step. The restaurant was a familiar world of clattering dishes, sizzling pans, and the constant low-level hum of a busy lunch service. The air was thick with the smell of coffee and fried food, a world away from the delicate scent of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. She went straight to the manager's office, bracing herself for the worst. She expected to see a look of anger on his face, a letter of termination on his desk. But when she knocked on the door and peeked in, the manager, a burly man with a gruff exterior but a surprisingly kind heart, just looked up from his paperwork and grunted. "You're late," he said, his usual grumpy greeting. "I know. I'm sorry," she stammered, her hands twisting in the hem of her apron. I needed to talk to you." "About last night?" The manager leaned back in his chair, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Heard about that?" he said, his voice softer than she expected. "Got a call this morning from the event organizer. Said you caused quite a stir."
Ow.
The young woman's heart sank. "I am so sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "It was a stupid, impulsive thing to do. I understand if you have to let me go." The manager stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, a slow smile spread across his face, a rare sight that transformed his usually gruff features. "Let you go?" He chuckled. "Are you kidding me?" The woman said, "You single-handedly saved their fundraiser. Said they raised more money than they ever have before. She said you were a hero." The young woman just stared at him, her mouth slightly agape, completely speechless. "I've been working here for 10 years, the manager continued, his voice filled with a quiet pride. "I've seen a lot of kids come and go, all with big dreams. Most of them give up, but you kept a piece of yours alive. Good for you. Now get out there and get to work. Table 4 needs their water refilled." She walked out of his office in a daze, the weight of her anxiety replaced by a light, buoyant feeling of disbelief. She wasn't in trouble. She was a hero. The word felt foreign and strange, but it also felt good. It felt like a validation of the risk she had taken. It's a sign that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't been a fool after all. The rest of the day passed in a blur. She moved through the restaurant with a new spring in her step, a small, secret smile playing on her lips. The world hadn't ended. In fact, in a small but significant way, it had opened up. The gruff manager's praise meant more to her than any standing ovation. It was a sign that she was seen, not just as a waitress, but as a person with a hidden talent, a person who was capable of something extraordinary. When her shift ended, she checked her phone and saw a message from an unknown number. It was the event organizer. "It was wonderful to meet you last night," the message read. "As I promised, I made a few calls. I have a friend who owns a small, intimate jazz club downtown. They're looking for a weekend pianist, someone to play for the afternoon crowd. It's not fame or fortune, but it's a start. It's a stage. Let me know if you're interested." The young woman read the message again and again, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and terror. This was it. The chance she had secretly been hoping for. The door she had thought was closed forever was now slightly ajar. But the fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in her stomach. What if she wasn't good enough? What if the magic of the fundraiser was a fluke, a one-time thing that could never be replicated? What if she got to the club, sat down at the piano, and her mind went completely blank? She thought about her small apartment, the stack of bills on her kitchen table, the security of her job at the restaurant. It was a safe, predictable life. But as she stood there, her phone in her hand, she realized it wasn't a happy life. It was a life of quiet desperation, a life lived in shades of gray. And for the first time in a long time, she saw a possibility of a life in color. She took a deep breath and typed back a reply. "I'm very interested. Thank you." In the next few days were a whirlwind of nervous anticipation. She spoke to the owner of the jazz club, a friendly, laid-back man who seemed more interested in her passion for music than her resume. They arranged for her to come in on Sunday afternoon to play a short set. It wasn't a paid gig, not yet. It was an audition, a chance to see if she was a good fit for the club's vibe. On Sunday, she woke up with a feeling of nervous energy that was both terrifying and exhilarating. She didn't wear her waitress uniform. Instead, she put on a simple, comfortable dress and a pair of flats. She looked at her reflection in the mirror and saw a stranger, a woman on the brink of something new and unknown. She took the bus downtown, the city passing by in a blur of color and sound. The jazz club was on a quiet side street, a small, unassuming place with a faded sign and a window filled with flyers for upcoming shows. It was a world away from the grand ballroom of the hotel, and that felt right. This wasn't about impressing a crowd of wealthy patrons. This was about the music. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of old wood, stale beer, and a faint, lingering scent of cigarette smoke. The club was dark and cozy, with small tables scattered around a small stage in the corner. On the stage, under a single, soft spotlight, sat a slightly worn-looking upright piano. It wasn't a gleaming grand piano, but to her, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The owner was there, and he greeted her with a warm smile. "Welcome," he said, gesturing towards the stage. "She's all yours. Take your time. Get a feel for her." She walked over to the stage, her heart pounding. She sat down on the bench, the worn velvet of familiar comfort. She placed her fingers on the keys, which were slightly yellowed and a little sticky, but felt like home. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, and then she began to play. She didn't play the same song she had played at the fundraiser. That song felt too big, too emotional for this small, intimate space. Instead, she played a quiet, simple jazz standard, a song she had known since she was a child. Her fingers, still a little stiff, found the notes, and the music flowed out, a soft, gentle sound that filled the quiet club. A few people were scattered around the room, sipping their drinks and reading the newspaper. At first they didn't seem to notice, but as the music continued they began to look up. their expressions shifting from indifference to curiosity and then to quiet appreciation. One man put down his newspaper and just listened, a small smile on his face. A woman at the bar closed her eyes, her head swaying gently to the rhythm. The young woman lost herself in the music, the fear and self-doubt melting away, replaced by a pure, unadulterated joy. This was who she was. This was what she was meant to do. She wasn't a waitress who played a little piano on the side. She was a musician. And in that small, smoky jazz club, on a Sunday afternoon, she finally felt like she had come home.